Well, ladies and gentlemen, just when you thought we had enough stuff going on in the world, it appears that more is actually on the table right now as the Trump administration is signaling that Cuba could very soon fall. And what would that fall look like? Well, we're not exactly sure, but a picture is starting to develop. The question is what would happen next? And let's face it, Cuba and the United States have have had something of a tenuous relationship now for several decades. We have a very, very large Cuban population within the United States that fled Cuba over several decades who are eager to see the downfall of the Castro regime. And I share that sentiment. Of course, I do ask, along with many Americans, is what exactly would happen next and why? Why is this the moment where we might see the downfall of the Castro regime and of the communist regime in Cuba? With me today, of course, we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How are you doing, Christian?
I'm doing well. How about you, Nick?
I'm doing pretty well. I just got done with 3 hours of Q&A at University of Virginia right now with Turning Point USA. So I'm not going to lie, I'm a little bit tired, but we're gonna go ahead and trudge along because this is a really important issue, and a lot of people are going to have questions about whether or not this falls into the whole American First concept. People are going to ask if we even have the bandwidth right now to be able to deal with one more foreign policy issue, especially one that could also signal regime change. So, Christian, take it away, man. Let's jump into the first article and read about what's going on.
Okay, so long story short, the Castro regime has seen better days here. So after Trump basically kidnapped the president of Venezuela,
removed an illegitimate leader from power, Christian. Thank you very much.
Oh no, you don't understand. I'm saying this like it's a good thing. But after we brought Maduro back here to the U.S., turns out that the remaining guys in Venezuela started taking some orders from the Americans, and one of the things that we told them to do was stop sending them oil to Cuba. Well, it turns out that I believe it's something like 40% of all of Cuba's energy generation, all of it, right? And 60% of their electrical generation comes from Venezuelan oil. So, when we say their entire energy sector, we're talking like cars, right? Not just turning on the lights, but it's like almost 2/3 of their power plants are powered by oil that comes from Venezuela. And when that stopped, you basically had effectively the total collapse of Cuba's economy. And obviously you and I knew that, their economy wasn't doing great to begin with, right? Because they've been a communist state for what, 60, 70 years now.
But look, there's communist states out there with different natural resource assets, but the big one for Cuba, obviously, energy generation. It does not have the ability to power its economy without imports. And Venezuela was propping up the Cuban economy such as it was through its imports, especially under Maduro, and then before that, Chavez. And obviously, there's other places in the Western Hemisphere that can get oil from. Mexico was sending oil in, but that got shut down real quick, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. But let's go in a little bit more on how Venezuelan oil is being specifically squeezed right now and the impact that's having on the economy.
Sure. So this first link that I've got up for you gives some details, and it's pretty dire for Cuba. So they talk about how Trump's embargo, he's really we've had an embargo against Cuba since the 60s, right? But we now have basically like an oil blockade, an energy blockade going on in Cuba. And at the moment, we've cut off about 75% of the island's oil supplies. And remember, oil is the thing that is driving their entire economy. Mm-hmm. And Cuba doesn't have really any of it. Mexico has it. Venezuela has it. Obviously, we have it. But for some reason, Cuba is, it is not sitting on any substantially large oil reserves. And most of their country's power plants are aging, inefficient, oil-powered power plants that, at this moment, they're basically going dark. So some of the comments here we're talking about, the fuel situation is getting pretty dire.
Well, I think it's like the first time in over a year that for a full month there were zero oil imports into Cuba, which is just they can't function without those imports, and so that's a massive stranglehold. So this whole idea of Venezuela now essentially, again, cooperating with the United States as opposed to cooperating with Cuba, China, Russia. This is just an absolute. There is the only other place that Cuba could have theoretically relied on for a significant portion of its oil would have been Mexico, because Mexico is a huge producer of oil, and Mexico had an existing agreement with Cuba, and it was going to send it over. And Donald Trump essentially signed another executive order which said that anybody that's importing oil to Cuba is going to face, significant tariffs. And it was amazing how shortly after that executive order, the president of Mexico was like, for our own sovereign reasons, we've decided we're not going to go ahead and ship more oil to Cuba right now, maybe just a little bit for humanitarian purposes. So they had essentially one tanker that went in. That was pretty much it. And now I think most of the trade from Mexico and Cuba has been reduced to just humanitarian supplies in the form of food and medicine. So, yeah.
There's another article that I've got that I'd like to show you that illustrates some of the specific details of the power outages that are going on.
Yeah.
If you take a look at this one, again, like I said earlier, it's like 2/3 of the country is going through blackouts right now. This is a giant energy deficit, 2,000
megawatts.
It goes on to say, this was from about a week ago. It's only gotten worse, by the way, since then. The next article that we've got will go into more detail about that. But, it talks about, here's the power plants that are basically completely shut down. Here's the ones that are under maintenance. Cuba has in recent years really poured money into building solar plants. And it actually makes sense if you think about, take the geopolitics aside, right? Their communist regime, they've got
Havana, as far as natural resources go, Havana's got a lot of sun.
Yeah, exactly. It actually makes sense. Long term, this actually could be something viable for Cuba, but it takes them years to develop this type of stuff, right? And they don't have anywhere close to the type of capacity right now to power the country using just solar panels. So what they've got going on right now is, it's more than half of the day in Havana, right? Which is where they're prioritizing, the remaining electricity that they've got. 13 hours and 33 minutes of uninterrupted service, right?
Yeah, we're not talking about rural parts of the island without much infrastructure. We're talking about the capital. The capital is going 13 hours without electricity. So that's also where I think 1.5 million Cubans live. I forgot what the total population of Cuba is. I'll try to look it up here real quick. But a significant portion of the population lives there, and of course, it's the seat of power as well. So,
there's one more tab that I want to show you. This is a map. This comes from Bloomberg. And this is a map that shows, we can see it from satellite photos, that Cuba's much darker at night than it has been in recent months. And you can see that they're trying to preserve the Havana metro area in terms, the blue color here is dimmer, the orange color is normal, and then the black is there's no light at all, right? And you can see that, rural Cuba, is totally in darkness, right? But they're trying to prioritize reroute.
By the way, I take that back. Havana is about, I guess, 2.1 million, 2,160,000 roughly, which is about, I think it's about 10% of the entire population lives in. It
dominates the effectively.
Yeah, but otherwise, it's looking a little bit North Korea-esque right now when you look at nighttime satellite photos.
Some of their other large cities, right? They've got 3 cities in the south that are decent sized. This one, Santiago, is right next to Guantanamo Bay, actually. And all 3 of the major cities in the south are going through almost total blackouts right now. Havana is the one where they're kind of keeping the lights on, but even then they've got rolling blackouts. So, okay, basically the point here is that the country's in big trouble, right? Its economy has been in shambles because it's been a communist Marxist state for 70 years now. It was already, limping along after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, right? Now its largest trading partner, basically just had their government overthrown.
Yeah.
And they're shutting off supply of oil. And so all these things are coming together, and it's creating the circumstances for the largest economic crisis that Cuba's seen since the early 1990s, again, right after the Soviet Union collapsed. And when that took place, there were actually mass street protests against the government. It was one of the only times that you saw effectively an uprising among the populace against the Castro regime. And the reason that the Castro regime was able to hold on was because they promised to liberalize certain elements of the economy. That's when they started really jumping into tourism for non-US tourists, obviously from Europe. They allowed some limited private businesses, but they've always pulled back on that after they can restabilize the regime, right?
Mm-hmm.
They also allowed, briefly, they allowed a substantial number of Cubans who hated the regime to actually flee the country. The Castro regime, like 30, 40 years ago, allowed something like 100,000 Cubans who were protesting to leave voluntarily.
Well, we also got to remember that one of the things they did under the Carter administration is they emptied out their prisons, and allowed those people to leave as well. So it wasn't just
definitely one of those guys gone.
Yeah.
So it's not like that they were just giving us, their freedom-loving, liberty-loving individuals. They also, yes, the Castro regime has also had a habit of sending us their criminals as well, because why not, right?
Yeah,
they're expected to win. But the point is that those 3 articles that we just went through, I think, kind of illustrate that, like, this is kind of a critical moment for the Castro regime. Like, they are, and it's funny, it's not, in some ways, it's not even the Castro regime anymore, because they did have like a transfer of power a few years ago where they have a new guy that's president. But like, the country's economy is in total shambles, and you can't run a country, like, even North Korea has electricity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, their economy is arguably worse than Cuba. But I think at this point that it's not surprising to me that Trump is talking about, that Cuba is going to fall pretty soon, which is the 4th article that I'll get to here.
I got to tell you, Marco didn't do himself any favors when he got up at that conference and just spoke fluent Spanish like that. I think Trump is ready to put Marco in charge of any both Venezuela and Cuba at this point. I got to tell you, though, I have been really, really impressed with Marco Rubio at the head of the State Department. I feel like it's the first time we've had a State Department with muscle. It's always felt to me like the State Department was being run by a bunch of like woke academics from Yale. And for the first time ever, we've got one where it's actually working in conjunction with the Department of War, as opposed to like constantly challenging it. But yeah, Trump tells CNN, Cuba is soon going to fall. I'm going to put Marco over there. Marco Rubio obviously has, this is a personal issue for Marco Secretary Rubio. I know it's also a personal issue for our own former Attorney General here in Virginia, Jason Miyares, who are both descendant from parents that had to flee Cuba in the Castro administration. But yeah, go ahead and elaborate.
I mean, it's basically what the headline says here. He's like, Cuba's going to fall pretty soon. By the way, unrelated, but Cuba's going to fall too. They want to make a deal so badly. This is Trump basically speaking on the phone with a reporter.
Yeah.
And he said that he's going to send Rubio over there to potentially negotiate. Problem is that the current regime that's ruled by, well, in a way, it's kind of still ruled by Raul Castro, who's Fidel Castro's younger brother. Now he's like in his mid-90s, though. Mm-hmm. Right? So their current president is a guy named Miguel Diaz-Canel, and he's been in office for about 5 years now.
Yeah, I doubt he's he may be the face, but I don't think he's actually running that country in any significant way. I mean, the Castro family has always had a pretty significant stranglehold on power.
Well, Diaz-Canel has basically said, like, we're not going to negotiate, right? He's putting out like the typical, like, revolutionary fervor talking points and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But like, it is, to me, it's pretty clear that Trump is signaling that, like, there are some people, right, potentially either in government or in the country, certainly the exile community, right, mm-hmm. that want to see some sort of transition away from the Marxist dictatorship that they've had.
Well, I think what's interesting too is the CNBC article where you can pull that up if you want. Trump reiterates threat of a friendly takeover as Cuba as fuel crisis deepens. And this is the part that's interesting to me. We've all talked about this before, where when it comes to Trump talking about these things, I think it was Ben Shapiro that actually said, I take Trump seriously. I don't take him literally sometimes. I think when the more Trump started to talk about this, and you look at how things are connected, because we see this issue all the time where when people look at these various conflicts, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Iran, where they look at them in isolation, all of a sudden people are trying to make sense of why are these things happening. When you look at them in conjunction with one another, they tend to make a little bit more sense. That's not to say that everything perfectly overlaps or that it's all just one big grand strategy. But it's clear that there's connections here. There's connections with respect to what Trump is trying to achieve within the Western Hemisphere and with what he considers to be very, very clear U.S. sphere of influence and really dominance. And then there's also the issues that we have over places like the Middle East. And none of these things are, again, when you view them independently from one another, you might say, what is the point of this? Or is this just Trump completely betraying, American first foreign policy? When you look at kind of the geopolitics of what's going on in Europe, what's going on in Asia, when you look at obviously how important oil is to the equation on all of this, all of a sudden this starts to make a little bit more sense, right? Russia and China had been very involved with the, Chavez and Maduro, who are obviously very openly hostile to the United States. All of a sudden, when the country with the largest known oil reserves gets taken out of the equation, that has an impact not just on Venezuela, not just on Cuba. It also has an impact on China, Russia. Now you look at what's going on with Iran. Obviously, again, I want to say this right up front because there's going to some people like, oh, Nick, you're in favor of all this. I am watching all of this. Some of this I'm a little bit more in favor of than others. Some of them a little bit more cautious, maybe even cautiously optimistic. But I'm still trying to view it through a critical lens. When I look at Iran, of course, I don't want the Ayatollah to be running Iran. And of course, I don't want the IRGC to be running Iran. But I've always been skeptical of, okay, what happens next? And one of the big questions that you look at with these things are like, okay, how are the conditions different now? And why are these things happening simultaneously? So when you look at Iran, obviously we've had a hostile relationship with Iran ever since 1979. A lot of people want to go back like, no, it all started in 1953 with the CIA-backed coup. And again, I think sometimes people want to give the United States a little bit. It's not that we shouldn't recognize the United States was involved and stirring the pot in some of these areas. But when you look at it through the lens of, yeah, we had the height of the Cold War going on, and we had a unfriendly regime that was trying to come in that was essentially nationalizing U.S. oil investments into a particular country, it shouldn't be shocking to anyone that the U.S. would play a role in supporting a dissident faction in Iran that was more friendly to us than it was to the communists or to the Islamists. And so when you look at it through that lens, it's not just the United States trying to pull all the strings. It's the United States trying to protect U.S. interests, especially in the backdrop of the growing threat of the Soviet Union. So when you look at it through that lens, I'm not saying it means that every U.S. decision was perfect or good, not at all. But it at least makes a little bit more sense on why these decisions would be made. Same thing when you look at it right now. The big issues going on are Russia and China. They're both nuclear powers. Russia's nowhere near the overall economic or military threat that it was during the Soviet Union, the height of the Soviet Union. But it's still a threat, as is demonstrated in Europe right now. Now, I don't consider Russia to be a major threat to the United States, but that doesn't mean it's not a threat to certain aspects within our interests. With respect to China, again, I don't think China poses some sort of imminent threat to U.S. military or economic dominance. It doesn't possess any major ability to invade the United States or anything of that nature. But can it cause a lot of damage? Yeah, in part it can cause a lot of damage because of how integrated it is into U.S. telecoms. We did an entire episode with two subject matter experts and a third one whose face we had to black out as we talked about just how integrated Chinese tech is into U.S. telecoms. And the reason why that's relevant is because China doesn't need to nuke San Francisco, right? It doesn't need to invade the West Coast. If it can actually do significant damage, at least short term, with respect to U.S. economics and our power grid, well, that would be reason enough to take any sort of threat from China seriously. And so I've said before, I'm far more concerned about that as a threat from China than I am about their military capability. Having said that, when you are strangling now these various countries, especially China, which is also dependent upon imported oil in order to keep its economy running, in order to keep its military effective. Now you can start to see, okay, what's going on in Iran is not just about their nuclear capability. It's not just about terrorism. It's also about, once again, taking another piece off the board with respect to major oil exports to another country, which we see as a geopolitical rival. Then you go back and you look at Cuba with this. Well, Cuba, again, Cuba doesn't pose a threat to the United States government. But if you look at the nature, and this is something I'd like you to talk a little bit more about as well, Christian, with the article you brought up. And that has to do with the conference that recently took place where we're talking about all of our various allies within the Western Hemisphere. And so these are people like, Bukele. These are people like Javier Milei in Argentina, the newly elected government in Chile. right? There's been kind of this back and forth dance for a while with various governments within the Western Hemisphere, within the Caribbean, within South America, where you kind of see this push from, you have left-wing regimes like the one you have in Brazil right now, the one you have in Colombia right now. Colombia is pretty much being run by a Marxist. Brazil is not much better with Lulu, but the recent polls show in Brazil that it looks like the leftists are once again falling out of fashion over there. Not completely, not entirely, but when you have the rise of, more, right-wing regimes in Chile and Argentina, and potentially the rise of a right-wing regime in Brazil, it's not hard to see why all of these things kind of coming together at the same time choke off oil supplies to some of our biggest rivals in Asia and Europe, while at the same time destabilizing probably, again, the longest thorn in the side of the United States, which was Cuba and the communist regime there, because that regime did dedicate itself to exporting communist revolutions and support in other places. So again, if you look at it all together, maybe you agree with it, maybe you don't agree with it. But it makes a lot more sense than what some people want to suggest, which is just, oh, this is all Israel pulling the strings, or this is all corporations pulling the strings. It's like, no. When you look at the long history of what's going on in all of these countries and how they impact one another and how they're connected, you can actually see what they're doing, right? Again, maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, but you understand what's going on. The big question, again, I think is, in Venezuela, what I was really skeptical of was this idea of, okay, we're going to take out Maduro and then we're going to run Venezuela. And I was like, whoa. How are you actually going to pull that off? Because when I looked at Venezuela, I'm like, okay, I'm a little bit concerned here, because it's not like, I know there's a lot of people in Venezuela that don't like the Maduro regime. And it seemed very evident that Maduro had stolen 2 elections. And so it's like, okay, what do you have? You have a Venezuelan exile who had, won the popular vote in Venezuela, who you could theoretically build a government around. And then one of the things that Trump did that I thought was very effective, especially and learning the lesson from Iraq, he didn't go down there and say, okay, now that we've taken out Maduro, anybody associated with the Maduro regime, you're all enemies of the state now, and you all need to step down immediately, and we're coming after you. Because what that would have done was it would have instantly destabilized Venezuela to the degree where anybody that thought that they were going to be essentially punished as a result of serving or being in or working with the Maduro regime was now going to see themselves as, okay, well, we don't have any options. I guess we got to work with the cartels, or I guess we got to work with other dissident forces, maybe getting support from Colombia or whatnot, in order to just survive or to, protect what they have. No, instead, the option was, look, if you cooperate and you play ball with an incoming Venezuelan regime that is supportive of the United States and that we're going to support, there is a pathway for you to kind of survive all of this without ending up in jail and without being like impoverished. You may even have to leave the country, but we're going to let you take some of your money with you. And obviously there was going to be people in Venezuela that thought that was a travesty of justice, right? If you were someone that was living in Venezuela that had been, just, oppressed by the Chavez and Maduro regime, you want your pound of flesh. But so far it looks like that's not happening. Like there's everyone's kind of understanding the real politique associated with how do you get a peaceful transition of power over in Venezuela without everything breaking down into civil war. With Cuba, I'm not sure that's going to be as easy to pull off, right? And do you have the article there from Axios talking about Rubio's secret squeeze? Yeah. If you want to bring that up, Rubio's secret squeeze on Raul Castro's Cuba. There's been warnings, like Jose Daniel Ferreira, and I apologize if I get the pronunciations wrong, right? He's a prominent Cuban opposition leader, and he has issued some very strong warnings emphasizing the need to fully remove or sideline the Castros, which is essentially to say that, okay, to the extent that the United States is going to go beyond just an economic squeeze on Cuba, to the extent that the United States might get a little bit more actively, whether they put troops on the ground or whatever it is, what he's essentially warning is that anything that doesn't involve like the full removal of the Castros, and probably a little bit more than just removal, is a non-starter. And that's an important question. I know we have some people in the chat right now who are from Cuba. It'll be interesting to see what their thoughts are with respect to that. Is there any pathway here where the United States can essentially work out some sort of deal, maybe similar to what we've seen in Venezuela right now, where you basically have, without directly flying down there with Delta Force and removing key leaders, is there any way that Trump can work with people on the ground, and then obviously working with the Cuban expat population in the United States, in Florida? Is there any way to work out some sort of deal where you do see a relatively peaceful transition of power? And can you honestly do that without cutting some sort of deal with the Castros? And I don't know the answer to that question. Because, again, when I look at it from an unconventional warfare perspective, whenever we're talking about regime change, one of the major things that I am looking for as someone that kind of worked and was trained in this area of operations is, where is your large scale domestic population? Where's your, dissident leaders? Where are the people that it's essentially going to replace the apparatus if you have regime change? And what do you do with the existing members of law enforcement, the military, the regime, et cetera? Because if you just go in there and do the whole de-Baathification thing, you can really destabilize. If you give people no other option but to fight or to join rebel groups, you can create a real problem. So how do you balance the understandable frustration and the understandable animosity between people that were terrorized by the Castro regime with the need to try to, facilitate a peaceful transition of power and having things not break into full civil war?
I mean, this is kind of the problem that you and I were talking about before we went live here. It is probably the biggest issue that I see is not like, could Trump overthrow the Cuban government if he really wanted to? Like, if he really wanted to, I doubt that this would go the way of the Bay of Pigs. Right? Like,
Yeah,
I don't think that the Cuban military could really stop the United States if they truly wanted to go in and topple the regime. But toppling the regime is not the same thing as governing the country, right? There's this famous quote from, I believe it's Genghis Khan, where he said, "Conquer the world on horseback is easy. Dismounting and governing it is hard." And in a way, it's kind of like,
yeah.
Who do you put in the day after you overthrow the regime? On one hand, you can just be like, oh, we'll just have the military run the country for forever. But that would be very unpopular probably in the US,
Yeah.
right? If we just had some sort of permanent military occupation. So you need to have somebody kind of governing the country. Well, the problem there is that Cuba doesn't have a long tradition of parliamentary democracy, right? Who did Castro overthrow? Oh yeah, it was Batista, who was a dictator himself, right? So at least in kind of living memory, Cuba does not have a history of free and fair elections. So you can't simply say, well, once we overthrow the existing communist regime, then we're going to have free elections and the country will just self-govern and it'll be a US ally and it'll have free markets and individual liberty and a written constitution like our own. That probably won't work. I'm not saying that it can't work, but it probably won't.
Yeah.
There's just not a long history of that type of tradition in Cuba. So then your next question is, okay, so who are the elites that would be running the country if you overthrow the existing elites? Well, you have another problem, right? Because there's only been one political faction governing the island for 70 years, and that's the Communist Party, right? It's Castro's inner circle. So if you topple these guys, and then you say nobody associated with the current regime, nobody associated with the Communist Party is going to have any say in running the country. Well, now you've just excluded arguably every single competent person that's left in the country. Again, you and I were just talking about this before we started filming. If you're in Cuba, if you were born in Cuba, right, and you grew up in the country, and you had you had an IQ above 100, and you had any sort of skill set or competency, you probably are in government or in the armed forces because the entire country's been nationalized, right? That's probably the pathway that you went down. You're either in government or you're in the military if you have any sort of skill set or competency. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're an ideological, hardcore committed Marxist, but you are almost certainly in the Communist Party. Now, if you go out there and you say anybody associated with the Communist Party doesn't have any ability to have any say in the country going forward, on one hand, you can get why that mentality would be used because we don't want the Communist Party running Cuba. That's the whole problem, right?
Yeah.
So that makes perfect sense. And then, to say nothing of the atrocities that the communist regimes committed, the human rights abuses, the fact that there's hundreds of thousands of Cuban dissidents in South Florida that were driven out of the country by these people. So I get the mentality to go out there and be like, all you guys get publicly hanged the minute that we come here. Like, I get that mentality, but the danger in all of this isn't, whether or not we find ourselves in a forever war. I think the danger is, could you create a power vacuum that we don't know who fills that? Basically.
Well, here's the other thing. And I had someone today at UVA, a student asked me, he goes, and I brought it up because someone was saying, we've been like, so I'm going to talk about Iran, but it's a parallel issue with Cuba. So somebody was saying, we've been talking about, Iran being an enemy of the United States and have a nuclear program for 30 years. What's different now? And I said, okay, well, here's what's different now. When you're looking at Iran, you had the Soviet Union, which, for at least until the early 90s, that took up the majority of the United States' attention. So everything was kind of through the lens of the Cold War. And then, not that long after that, we had, dual wars that were going on for decades in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so that was the primary focus of the U.S. And then within Iran itself, you had them starting to get a little bit more sophisticated with respect to the development of nuclear weapons, combined with now a population that was willing to actually actively protest against the government despite major crackdowns. I said, so when you look at all of those things in tandem, so you don't have the United States focused on the Soviet Union or two other wars in the Middle East, plus you have the Iranian regime, again, Trump being convinced that the Iranian regime can never be trusted with a nuclear weapon or never be trusted to sign a peace deal that wouldn't include them cheating. Plus you have the conditions on the ground in order to potentially replace the existing government with one more friendly United States. So when you add all those things together, whether or not you think the equation still, whether or not you think the cost or benefit analysis still plays out, those are different conditions. Now, how does that relate to, Cuba, right? How does anything I just relate to Cuba? Well, because you're looking for similar things with respect to conditions and catalysts. The difference is Iran is made a lot more complex by the fact that it's on the other side of the world and a vastly different social, economic, political, and theological conditions, which just makes it a nightmare, especially when you add Islam into the mix, right? That all makes it a nightmare. You go over to Cuba, and now you're not talking something about the other side of the world. You're talking about something 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And you're talking about a culture that is not so alien to the United States or alien to the West that we don't understand all the various dynamics. It's a lot easier for us to understand those dynamics. And now you're talking about a Cuba which is increasingly isolated because during the Soviet Union, it was supported by during the Cold War, it was supported by the Soviet Union. It was supported by other regimes in South America when it came to like Chavez or Maduro. Now you're looking around going, okay, when we look at the leftist regimes within South America, you largely have Brazil, Colombia, Mexico as kind of the major left-wing powers. Brazil's in some trouble right now. Mexico understands that it's so closely united to the United States with respect to trade that even if it wants to help the Cuban regime, it understands that its economy would collapse if the U.S. really wanted to push higher tariffs. So everyone's kind of limited. And then obviously with Venezuela not being able to ship oil to Cuba, it's now completely isolated. And so if you are in the Cuban power structure right now, and you're looking around and you realize like, okay, there's no one coming to save us, right? There's no other power that will lean on the United States or remind the United States that it's got bigger fish to fry. At the same time that you've got a much more wealthy Cuban population in the United States that would be interested in going back to Cuba, reinvesting, bringing the sort of technical expertise that would be necessary and required to run the country. When you look at all those things, so if you're a mid-tier manager within the Cuban economy right now, right, which a lot of their economy is run by the military, you're looking at this going, am I dying for the glory of the revolution at this point, right? If you're dealing with an Islamic culture, you have people that have been conditioned to essentially say, I will fight to the death because I'm going to heaven afterwards. Communists don't have a heaven to go to, right? They don't have a heaven to go to. And if you're looking around going, yeah, we're kind of all alone, if someone offers you a good enough deal, you're far more likely to take it. And one of the ways that we can see that that's true is by actually looking at what's going on in Venezuela right now. And so when I look at the conditions in Cuba, you're right. I don't see tens of thousands of Cubans rioting through the street or protesting through the street, the regime. But I do see other conditions would suggest to me that Cuba could be ripe for a fall, especially because you have the United States willing to flex its economic muscle The fact that it's already flexed its military muscle in Venezuela and Iran demonstrates that when President Trump says he wants to use the military, he will do so. So the threat can be enough. And then when he actually exercises the economic power that the United States can bring to bear, now we're talking about a genuine stranglehold. And so that's the part where I could see Cuba in a situation where the regime could fall primarily because they voluntarily choose to, on some level, right? With a good enough deal. The next question is like what you just said, like, okay, what happens next? And I could see a situation. Again, this is like best case scenario. I could see a situation where your mid-tier leadership, the people that are actually, to the extent that the power plants or to the extent that the infrastructure is running, again, they're not dying for the glory of Castro. They're not dying for the glory of communism or Karl Marx. You give them a good enough deal, they'll come online. The real question is okay, with the expat population, what's the process for them coming back to essentially reinvest, buy up property? And then how do you do that? How do you manage that process while not alienating the current Cuban population that is down there to where you're not creating additional resistance groups? And one of the things I would love for anybody that's Cuban and in the chat right now is to maybe give, maybe some of their opinion or insight on how do you think the average Cuban taxi driver or the average Cuban that is working on a farm right now, how do they respond to this? What happens next if all of a sudden you did work out some sort of deal? And what does that interim government look like? Because again, I think the Cuban expat population in the United States is going to play an oversized role. In fact, I can't imagine any of this going on or developing the way it has without that conversation taking place between the Trump administration and the Cuban expat population within the U.S. I can't imagine those conversations have not already been had, and I would be shocked if Marco Rubio already doesn't know, who the potential leadership figures would be, what sort of roles they would play, what sort of investment is going to take place, what sort of companies are going to be playing a role in kind of the rebuilding or reshaping of Cuba. Because one thing that is outside of all of this that is going to play an oversized role in this is the midterms coming up. Because there are a lot of people on the right that are angry with Trump. There's a lot of people that supported Trump that feel as if the foreign stuff in Venezuela and Iran and the fact that this is still going on with Ukraine, even though I think part of what Trump is doing right now is to try to bring a peaceful resolution to the war in Ukraine. But all they see is we're getting involved in way too many foreign stuff, and that's not what I signed on for. And so there's this balancing act that the administration has to run between domestic considerations and between their own voter base and what you could see as the foreign policy objectives of the administration. And so I'm not really, I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure how that plays out right now. Because there are a lot of people that are frustrated with the Trump administration on the foreign side. Again, I don't consider myself one of those people because I never had this expectation that Trump wasn't going to be involved in foreign policy or that he was just going to completely focus on the domestic side. But I think a lot of people understandably believe that what's going on in Iran right now is way outside the boundaries of what they signed up for. And so I'm not sure how bringing Cuba into the mix at this point, even if the conditions might be ripe for it, even the conditions might be very good for it, I still think, I don't know how they got away with Venezuela in part because it was a kind of one and done strike. That was it, right? Iran is not going to be that. Let's talk a little bit about what would have to take place in Cuba for this to be a win for the Trump administration ahead of the midterms?
I mean, in my opinion,
you
have to have a counter elite within the country that would be dedicated to overthrowing their own government and replacing them with American assistance. And this happens in a very short time frame, like a month, right? I mean, potentially even less than that, but basically about a month probably. So it would have to be either some sort of concession made by the Cuban government to abandon their commitment to Marxism, right? And reorient themselves towards the United States, or it would have to be effectively some sort of coup in the country, right? That topples the government, and then the new government opens up negotiations with the United States in order to ally Havana closer to Washington. I mean, the third option, which I think is the most dangerous, is military intervention, right? It's we go in, we do the Venezuela thing, we drop the paratroopers into Havana, and we physically topple the government that way. Again, I'm actually willing to bet that a military operation would probably be successful in the opening 24 hours or first week or whatever, similar to Iran. But it's more of one of those things where it's like, if you send boots on the ground to topple the government, then you're almost certainly going to need to keep boots in the country in order to maintain law and order and set up a new government, right? Because it's no longer an internal political affair that topple, right? It's not the old school like Pareto circulation of elites where you almost have like a revolution or a coup inside the country, and there's an organic element that reaches out to the United States and says, hey, we want to strike a deal with you guys. Instead, it's we come in and we physically remove the regime. If that happens, then suddenly Cuba turns into a place where we have to permanently station, several thousand troops for, however long it takes to set up a new government. At that point, you're doing nation building. And I'm not convinced that parliamentary democracy can even work in Cuba, to be honest. I don't see any history of it working in Cuba. Cuba has been run by strongmen dictators for the vast majority of its history. And so that's the biggest problem. I don't actually think that the logistics of how do you topple the Castro regime is the problem here. It's the day after problem that I see. And if you thing I'll say is if you destabilize the regime too much, you could also create a refugee crisis, right? Like you overthrow the Castro regime. How many millions of people in Cuba will want to go to South Florida? Because
there will certainly be a push to say that, well, if you destabilize the regime, well, then shouldn't you open up the United States to the people that want to come over? And again, that'll be a big debate. But look, the bottom line is if you really want to show how good America is, well, as America celebrates its 250 years, it's a great time to recognize the ranchers who quietly fed our country through every challenge. And that's where Good Ranchers comes into play, because Good Ranchers is the only meat company fully dedicated to America at every step. That's sourcing exclusively from local American farms and handling everything from packaging to customer support right here in the USA. I'm a subscriber myself, and I love how easy it is to pause, delay, or move my order whenever life gets busy. But I got to tell you right now, I don't pause that. I do not pause my Good Ranchers subscription because I absolutely love them. I think they have the best American-raised beef, pork, poultry, and wild-caught seafood. Not only that, but if you go to goodranchers.com and use code Nick, that's goodranchers.com, code Nick, you're going to get $25 off your first order and free meat for life with your subscription. That means that you can wrap your Good Ranchers steak in your Good Ranchers bacon. And I can't think of a better way to celebrate America and its 250th anniversary. That's goodranchers.com, code Nick for $25 off and free meat in every box. That's right, goodranchers.com, American meat delivered. Go check them out. Okay. Well, and this is the part two where I want to get into. We got some stuff going on in the chat here, and look, this is one of those things that's been that's been an issue dividing the right. Right? It's this idea of, do we want the United States to play a larger role in the world, or do we want the United States to just focus more internally? And I would say that the majority of the right has been focused on this idea of just look at things internally. It's not to say that they're all isolationists. It's more of just we're tired of the foreign interventions. Now, I completely understand the caution with Iran in large part because, again, it's over in the Middle East. It's another Muslim country. There's just very, very different considerations when you talk about things like regime change. Now, I disagree with some of the people in the chat that are saying we've never had successful regime change. Yes, we have. There has been successful regime change that the United States has participated in, but it's generally required either overwhelming U.S. military force and occupation, or it's required countries that had already adapted or adopted certain aspects of Western governance that made it more conducive, or there was a very, very easily identifiable common enemy that caused that country to more closely unify with the United States. So it's not that it's never happened. It has happened, and it has happened successfully. But it's always incredibly difficult. It's always a lot more complex than it looks like on paper. So right now, what we see going on in Venezuela has been, at least at this point, positive. And this goes into what I've referenced before on America First Foreign Policy and what Matt Walsh pointed out. Matt Walsh was like, look, I supported Venezuela, I supported Greenland because the cost-benefit analysis added up. And I looked at, what sort of benefits could we potentially get with Venezuela? Well, okay, you can remove a bad regime that was hostile to the United States, that was collaborating with our enemies, that was shipping fentanyl into the country. And now you can turn it into a potentially friendly regime where you cut off oil from Russia and China. You get more oil into the United States at better prices, and you potentially cut off fentanyl. And so far, that seems to have added up and worked really well. He also mentioned Greenland. Not that we were going to invade Greenland, but it was this idea of pushing military and economic power in order to get what we wanted. And we did. We got a really, really good deal with Denmark with respect to Greenland. Everything from being able to establish, posts up there, military infrastructure, as well as access to things like rare earth minerals, while at the same time kind of pushing China out of that area, because China had been pushing for rare earth minerals in Greenland as well. So Matt Walsh looks at that and goes, I get it. Makes sense. I like it. I like the fact that Trump went in there. He kind of used a heavy hand, but he got what he wanted with relatively little cost or casualties to the United States. Iran looks differently, and it is different. It is different. There's no question that even though I see identifiable benefits for America to what's going on in Iran right now, I also see a significant higher cost associated with it. And so time will tell on whether or not the strikes and whether or not the amount of investment the United States has put into now effectively facilitating regime change in Iran is going to be worth it. I have said before that the reason why I'm willing to give Donald Trump more latitude in this than I ever would have given Obama, Biden, or any of the Bushes, right, was because I believe that Donald Trump understands the value of a punitive expedition versus long-term, the United States is now responsible for bringing parliamentary democracy to a part of the world that doesn't want it, has never had it, is not interested in it. Cuba, on the other hand, what is the cost-benefit analysis with respect to Cuba? There was somebody in the chat earlier that was saying that they believe that the Cuba is a larger threat to U.S. national security, and they brought up things like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, it's important to understand that Cuba was not what represented the major threat to the United States. It was the Soviet Union that was able to operate on Cuba. Well, that doesn't exist anymore. That dynamic doesn't exist anymore. So we might not like the communist regime in Cuba, and it's not to say that that communist regime couldn't, cause irritations to the United States, but it's not as if it poses a major security threat. It just doesn't. So the question now is, okay, the benefits potentially for the United States being involved in Cuba and facilitating a transition of power over there has to do with, okay, we would have, access to Cuba with respect to Cuban markets, although there's not a tremendous amount that they produce. It's obviously one of the things that Cuba used to be known for was as a tourist destination. We could also argue that it would be something where it would be nice to essentially have eradicated communism effectively from the Western Hemisphere. Now we still got issues in Colombia, we still got issues in other places, but Cuba has really stood out as the exporter of the communist revolution to the Western Hemisphere, along with the Soviet Union, and that would essentially be gone. The other thing that could potentially happen is with the right management, Cuba actually could be, I think, a dynamic economy. It's not going to be a major powerhouse or whatnot, right? It's an island, right? It's an island in the Caribbean. But it could be a dynamic economy. It could be a place. It could be obviously a gorgeous place for tourism and things of that nature. But it really does come down to the question of what sort of, so the benefits are there, right? But the costs. And this is one where I look at Cuba right now, and I feel as if this is kind of a low cost, low benefit environment, right? Venezuela, at least for right now, was low cost, high benefit. Iran is, there theoretically could be a high benefit over there. If you actually get a friendly regime in Iran, there's actually a very high benefit for U.S. interests. very high benefit. First of all, you will have stabilized a region of the world that has been largely unstable for decades, and it's incredibly important because of oil. You will have created a situation where the Abraham Accords could potentially go forward now without the negative influence of Iran, and now all of a sudden you have normalization of relationship between countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, potentially even Qatar. I mean, I'm not promising that one, but and Israel, which would be good for the region. You cut off a major supplier of oil to China in the form of a new regime with Iran. So all of that would be significant benefits. There's no question those would be significant benefits. However, you also have much higher costs over there, and you actually have much higher risk of it all going awry, right? Things could turn in Iran very, very quickly and go very, very poorly. And I think we have to be honest about that. But with Cuba, again, I'm going back to it. I feel like this is kind of low cost, low benefit to the United States. And when I say low benefit, please understand me, especially to all the Cubans that are living in the United States, generational living in the United States. I'm not meaning to diminish what this could mean for Cuban expats living in the US. I know this would be absolutely huge for them. And it would be wonderful to be able to diminish or to be able to remove, the last communist regime. But again, I just think practically speaking, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I just think practically speaking, this is a low cost, low benefit operation. Christian, what's your take on it?
I probably would agree with you. Like, to me, the benefit is you wrap up probably one of the last remaining, not the last, but one of the last remaining flashpoints of the Cold War, right? Like, part of me is like, as an American, I would love to see the communist regime that's 90 miles off of Key West collapse, simply because it would be kind of like a vindication of the United States. It would be a victory geopolitically, again, dating back to the Cold War era and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I also think that it's not that I think this. Like, we know for a fact that the Cuban government has facilitated supporting socialist and communist agitators all throughout Latin America. And removing that removes a power center that continuously supports, organizations and groups that basically hate us. So those are two benefits. One, and the last one is that, like, look, it's in our backyard. Like, if we really want to get away from engaging in regime change wars on the other side of the planet, well, I mean, one of the ways we can do it is we can start, throwing our weight around in the Caribbean, which by all rights should belong to the United States. And so, like, I actually think that there are legitimate arguments in favor of doing it, but on the same token, there are legitimate arguments against doing this that I don't think are discussed as much. One I brought up earlier, which was the power vacuum. The second one is the potential for a migration crisis on our doorstep. I think that there are millions of impoverished Cubans that would love to come to the United States. And we've already taken in, by and large, the best and brightest individuals in Cuba. We took in the business owners who had their businesses expropriated by the Cuban government. We took the intellectuals that were anti-Marxists. We took in the political dissidents. Like we took in effectively the type of people that would normally be running a country like Cuba if it weren't a Marxist state.
Well, let me ask you this real quick. How many of those people do you think returned to Cuba? Because we're talking about multiple generations now, right? A lot of those people that you just described that came over decades ago, right? So they've lived in the United States. Their kids have lived in the United States. How much, and this would be a great question for our friend Jason Miras, how much interest do you think there is for the expat community in Cuba to go back to Cuba to help run the country?
Some of them might, but I would not be surprised if a significant majority of them stayed in the U.S., to be honest. A lot of them have set down roots in South Florida. They've lived there for decades now. They have kids, they have grandkids that haven't grown up in Cuba. They've only grown up in Florida. And so from their perspective, they're like, I'm an American. Like, you forget that Trump won at something like 65, almost 70% of the Cuban vote. Like, he won the Cuban vote by a larger margin than he won the white vote by.
Well, I think the other thing that's interesting here is when you look at Venezuela, there was a lot of Venezuelans that had very recently immigrated to the United States and who were very eager to get back, reinvest, establish things, be a part of a new government. I'm not sure the same sort of motivation exists for the Cuban expat population. And when I say that, I'm not sure of it. I mean that. I'm not saying that as analysis, posing as a question. I really don't know.
How many individuals living in South Korea would move to North Korea if Kim Jong-un's regime collapsed and the two countries reunited?
I'm gonna go with 0.
Like, how many people in West Germany moved into East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of East and West Germany?
Yeah.
None of them did. Effectively, none of them did. What you saw was vast numbers of people in East Germany moving to the West because that's where the jobs were, that's where the economic opportunity was. And you would see the same thing in South Korea, right? You would see North Koreans moving into South Korea because they're impoverished and the jobs are in South Korea. You wouldn't see anybody moving from South Korea into North Korea. A small, tiny number would move there and set up shop or businesses or buy up property or something.
That's what you would see. So, and again, this can have a destabilizing effect. I talked about this with Daniel DiMartino, who's from Venezuela and an economist. And I said, well, okay, Daniel, I'm looking at Venezuela right now, and obviously I see huge economic opportunities with respect to minerals, with respect to real estate, with respect to tourism, with respect to oil, right? But all of that is going to take some time to develop. And if you have a bunch of people flooding back into the country and then buying up all the best stuff at like rock bottom rates, you're going to have a certain sector of the population that no longer feels liberated, right? They feel invaded. And that's kind of the question of potentially what could go on in Cuba is that, yes, you would be able to open up Cuba to foreign investment in a way that hasn't existed for decades. And there would be a tremendous amount of interest because you would see people for the first time. I mean, when you're talking about, an average Cuban worker, making just pennies on the dollar compared to Americans. And now you're talking about, again, the world's largest economy, 90 miles off the coast where people are making, $50 a month, right? It just, you have the huge incentive structure for people to come to Cuba. Because I think what the United States would do is they would say, look, you're not allowed to just come to the United States, but we're going to allow foreign investment to come down. And I do think that overall that would be beneficial for the Cuban people, but that would be very, very easy for an advantageous Cuban politician to then say, yes, see, this is what's happening. We're being invaded by the West now. They're buying up all of our property. They're buying up all the farms. They're buying up all the businesses. There's nothing left for the Cubans. And Daniel DiMartino talked about this in Venezuela, where they actually had a strategy where it was to say, look, we're going to allow for foreign investment, but we're also going to be careful about how we do it. So it's not something where you just have a flood of people coming in and buying up all of the infrastructure or property. Obviously, you may want some of that because you're going to bring back all of the skill sets. This was another conversation I had with somebody at UVA today, where it's like, it's really easy to pretend like this is all about infrastructure or assets. No, it's really about minds. You have some people that are very, very capable and qualified to run the oil industry, and you have other people that have no idea what they're doing. And communists have been proving this point over and over again, because every time they nationalize an industry and give it to the workers, it turns out it doesn't function well, because not everybody can run a business or oil infrastructure or mineral resources. And so that's going to be the balance that they're going to have to strike. It's just, I think within Cuba, it presents a different challenge than it would in Venezuela. And again, I don't know exactly how that looks.
So, I mean, if you take all of this together, to me, I think the dangers of, by the way, we didn't even bring up the fact that the communist regime in Cuba is slightly different than the Maduro regime in Venezuela, in the sense that they don't have a substantially large drug trafficking or human trafficking industry.
It's a jump off point, but it's
cartels are not nearly as active in Cuba as they are in Mexico or Venezuela. They typically bypass the island. And I guarantee you, if you toppled the Cuban, if you toppled the existing Cuban government, cartels would probably start using it as a waypoint to ship drugs into South Florida. So you combine the potential for a power vacuum, the potential for a mass refugee crisis in Cuba pouring into South Florida. And again, the type of people that would be fleeing Cuba to South Florida today are very different than the type of people that were fleeing 60, 70, even 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I know personally, I was born in South Florida. I spent 25 years going back there I still have half my family lives in South Florida. Now, I'm not Cuban, but I know plenty of people that actually are Cuban in South Florida. And by and large, the Cuban population in South Florida more or less, I'm not saying uniformly, right? But like more or less, they are entrepreneurial. They are they're communitarian and family oriented in some respects, but they're also individualist in another respect. They're a lot of them are business owners. A lot of them are very patriotic Americans, even though they're first or second generation Cubans, and they're deeply conservative and very anti-Marxist and anti-communist, obviously.
Yeah.
And which makes them in some ways a natural Republican voting constituency, if you think.
Yeah.
But think about the type of people that would be pouring into South Florida if the Cuban regime collapsed tomorrow. They would not be those type of people. The point is that Cubans, no group is monolithic, right? Mm-hmm. And so the existing Cuban population in South Florida are a natural conservative constituency that, by and large, vote overwhelmingly Republican and probably will continue to do so into the near future. That is not to say that the type of people that would be fleeing this island and coming to South Florida if we overthrew the communist regime would do the same thing. It could just be like the Biden wave all over again, right? Imagine 1 million Cubans pouring into South Florida. By no means does that mean that they will be like the existing Cuban population in South Florida.
Well, I don't think that, look, regardless of what happens in Cuba, I don't think the Trump administration is going to allow for the mass importation of people into Cuba. I think what you're more likely to see is, again, a return of certain expats, and then it's going to be a question of how does the country run and who's going to be responsible for what. And the thing is, I think at this stage, there's probably, again, I think there's probably a lot of conversations that have happened between the State Department, the Trump administration, Cuban expats, and they probably have answers to some of these questions that I do not. But again, I just, I go in and I don't really know what happens next with that, because if the regime, I don't think the regime falls suddenly in this one. I really do think that what Trump is looking for right now is he's putting the economic squeeze, and then it's going to be a question of how does he cut a deal? How does he cut a deal with existing people running Cuba? And then who comes in to essentially facilitate the transfer of power? If you could work that part out correctly, and I do think there's a pathway where you could do that effectively, because I don't know. My impression is, and I got some people screaming at me in the comments, like, where are your objective facts? Like, hey, sorry, dude, I don't have access to all of the data on the ground going on in the minds of Castros. What I can say is that, again, when I look at the conditions on the ground, I don't know that you have a population that's going to uprise and fight like a lengthy civil war and insurgency campaign against an incoming government, because I can't see a situation where the economic conditions of the Cuban people don't automatically improve the moment the communist regime is done. And now, in part, it's going to improve because communism sucks and it's repressive and it can't run an economy to save its life. But the other reason why it's going to drastically improve, and this is where the communists will say, see, it's all the Americans' fault, is because sanctions are going to automatically be lifted, right? And you're going to see an inflow of foreign investment, combined with all of a sudden the country now is going to be allowed to purchase all the things that it's currently not allowed to purchase. And so the end result is that if you have the population, which is currently toiling away under a communist regime and, the various sanctions, and then all of a sudden all of that's lifted in coordination with an incoming regime, that tends to generate a great deal of loyalty to whoever has come in to facilitate that transition. And so again, there's going to be some people that accuse the Americans of, we're the ones that put the stranglehold on it. Otherwise, Cuba would be a flourishing socialist utopia. Which I think is garbage. But there's no question that the U.S. is actually having a huge impact right now on the status of the Cuban economy. So if you can pull that transition off effectively, then I think you could generate a lot of loyalty within the population that's currently there. You could avoid any sort of armed resistance to the transition of power, especially if you cut a deal with key figures within the current government. And then it's just a process of allowing that all to naturally development through largely private investment and just lifting sanctions. It's not like the U.S. is going to have to station a bunch of troops down in Cuba in order to maintain security. That's the best case scenario. Worst case scenario, as far as I can see it, would be something where if you did have some sort of like toppling and fractionalization, where now people are fighting over existing resources, and now this kind of descends into basically kind of like gang fights or mafia fights within Cuba. But I just don't think the probability of that taking place is all that significant personally. So, again, I'm going to go, I'm going to go with, I think it's low cost, low benefit, not no benefit, but low cost, low benefit. And if it's going to succeed, the United States can help facilitate the transition, but we can't run it. And we can't be seen as being responsible for trying to manage the country. I will tell you this much. One of the things that I think would potentially hurt Donald Trump from this is if we do facilitate a transition and then all of a sudden you see a bunch of U.S. tax dollars going to Cuba in order to prop it up. That's the part where I think you got a lot of voters in the midterm going, look, I'm done. I'm just done, because that's not what I signed up for. I want U.S. tax dollars being invested in the United States, or I want them coming back in the form of tax cuts. But I don't want to see us propping up one more government around the world. So,
no, I agree. If you had a coup, if you had a revolution, right? If you had some sort of counter elite within the Cuban government that displaced the existing one and then opened up negotiations with the U.S., something like that, I think would be far different than a direct military operation and an occupation and then nation building and all of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So it's not to say that Trump shouldn't put the squeeze on the Cuban government. I don't think that there's really much that costs us to continue the embargo and continue turning off the supply of oil. If anything, it might facilitate what I just outlined. But I think there's a big difference between that and engaging in a round of nation building that involves, permanently keeping 20,000 troops stationed in Cuba and pouring billions of dollars into nation building. So it just depends on the type of angle that they go. If they have dissidents in the Cuban government that are actually in negotiations for something, I think that's very different than planning a military operation where we run the country and we have to start pouring money into Cuba at the same time that they might have some sort of refugee crisis, or you have drug cartels coming in. I think that would be a big mistake. But if there is a way to topple the Cuban government in a way that doesn't really cost us anything, then why wouldn't we? I think it's pretty obvious that we should do it. So it just depends on how you go about doing it ultimately.
Well, I do think Trump has demonstrated that he's much better at applying U.S. economic power without automatically resorting to military power in order to achieve U.S. objectives. And again, I think this is one where theoretically it could, I think it could end up well for the United States, well for the Cuban people, bad for the Cuban regime, or bad for the communists. And it would also signify that things are changing within the Western Hemisphere in a way that's far more positive toward the United States. So, yeah, I just we'll see. We'll see. I think we're looking at three situations right now between Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba. I think we had low cost, high reward. Potentially high cost, high reward, or high cost, very little reward in Iran. Time will tell. And then with Cuba, I think it's low cost, low reward. But again, it could potentially require the least out of American taxpayers. It would be nice. And I think we're going to see this in Venezuela, where the operation in Venezuela will actually yield far greater benefits to the United States with respect to access to oil, with respect to a friendly regime, where we actually come out on the net when it comes to the economics of it. Somebody already pointed out, it's like, how much oil did you get from Iraq? Like, no, point taken. I'm not defending U.S. involvement in Iraq, even though I did 2 combat tours over the rim. I'm just saying that I think we should distinguish between that which is going on in Iraq and that which is going on in Venezuela or Cuba or Iran. Anyways, okay. Well, look, I've looked through. I think I'm trying to find out some of the questions in here. I think I didn't see anyone coming up right away. Secret Basin, yes, communists are cold and unfriendly. Beware of unfriendly communists the most. Junior Von Clare said, example, there's no way I would have gone after Maduro. Sometimes a different mindset is needed for big risks, I guess. Coming in late. Hopefully I'm not too off here. Yeah, no, this is one of the problems is that Americans right now, because of Iraq and Afghanistan, are definitely taking the mindset where we're done. We're kind of done with the world. We've got enough domestic problems. And that's a fair argument. That is an absolutely fair argument. My contention is that when you look at it, the United States and the federal government specifically does have a responsibility when it comes to foreign affairs. I don't think it is America first or MAGA or anything else to obviously ignore the rest of the world. It's just a question of when should we be involved and to what extent. And I think the cost benefit analysis is the first question we have to ask. How can we be reasonably certain that whatever sort of foreign intervention or foreign operations that we're going to launch are going to, on the net, benefit the United States? And again, I'm not sure where Cuba falls into that, except for what I just said: low risk, low reward. But we'll see. We'll see. And again, to any of the Cubans that suffered under the Castro regime, again, I don't mean to be flippant or disrespectful to any of you. I would love to see communism eradicated from the entire world, right? And again, I hope it will happen very soon in Cuba. My hope, though, is that when it happens, that it does so in such a way to where, again, the Cuban people are able to set up the sort of government that works for them, and that they can have positive relationships with the United States apart from an oppressive communist regime. Once again, thank you all very much for joining us. For those who got something out of us or thought it was beneficial, by all means, please give us a like, subscribe, follow, all of that good stuff. For those of you who think that we're absolutely full of crap, by all means, join some of the people in the audience here to tell us just how full of crap you think we are. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next episode.